Hello, welcome. It's a real pleasure to host today Gita Gopinath, IMF Chief Economist, on Wheeler's Institute for Business and Development, fourth Rethinking Globalization series. Let me give some background about the Wheeler Institute, which was founded with a generous gift of Tony and Maureen Wheeler, founders of Lonely Planet, with the aim to promote research, teaching, and outreach on the intersection of business and development. As I mentioned before, we are very privileged to have today with us Gita Gopinath. Gita, a dear friend who has been doing some amazing work recently. Since, I think now for 2.5 years, Gita has been the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund on sabbatical from Harvard University's Department of Economics. I don't want to discuss much about her many accomplishments, rather than mentioning only two. First, Gita serves as a role model for girls and women all across the world. She grew up in India, and she spent her youth years, she did her undergrad there, and then she moved to the US, eventually to obtain her PhD from Princeton and work at the University of Chicago and Harvard. Secondly, I must confess that Gita has been doing some amazing work as the Chief Economic Counselor of the IMF, doing some very topical research and outreach that touches the lives of many people, including, for example, inequality, sustainable development. And Gita, while you're doing this great work, COVID-19 hit the world economy. I think you coined it eloquently, the great lockdown. So thanks a lot for being with us. And my first question would be, we read recently the IMF forecast about the recovery, which seems, your forecast at least, predict to be asynchronous. So why don't you give us an update on that, especially given the dire developments in India, your home country. I hope that everybody is doing well there, but why don't you give us an update, and thanks again for taking the time and being with us.
Thanks, Elias. Really, first of all, just great to see you. I'm looking forward to meeting in person at some point. In terms of the outlook, the first thing to keep in mind, since this is first and foremost a health crisis that the world is grappling with, is if you look at global cases, there is a new peak now, a new record high in terms of global cases. More than 3 million people have died because of COVID-19. And so we're not out of the pandemic. The pandemic still exists, right? The question is, what do we expect going forward? Now, because of the fact that there has been, I would say, phenomenal success with vaccine discovery in terms of multiple vaccines being available, there is hope that we will exit this crisis at some point. Now, in terms of the numbers, 2020 was the biggest recession, biggest peacetime recession since the Great Depression. So that's about a 100-year period. The world economy had growth of minus 3.3%. As a comparison, the global financial crisis growth was minus 0.1%. So this is, many order of magnitudes bigger. This year for 2021, we have growth projected to be 6% for the world. And then in 2022, it moderates to 4.4%. But what's very important here is that while there is a 6%, which shows a strong rebound, it varies dramatically across different parts of the world. There are some countries that are recovering much faster. China already back to pre-pandemic levels in 2020. The US expected to be there very soon. And then you have many other countries of the world where they are seeing very slow recoveries. So let me give you an example. So if you look at the 5-year period between 2020 and 2024, you have the hit to per capita income, the projected hit to per capita income on an annual basis relative to pre-pandemic projections is about 2% for advanced economies, and it's about 6% for emerging and developing economies, excluding China. So these are countries that are starting off at a lower per capita income base, and they're getting hit hard, again, relative to where they would have been in the absence of the pandemic. This is very different from after the GFC. After the global financial crisis, it was advanced economies that were more negatively hit, and not the emerging and developing economies. This time around, it's flipped around, and that's the big divergence that we worry about. And what is the source of these divergences? One, vaccine access. So while discovery has been great, access to vaccines has been highly inequitable. And some parts of the world are well ahead, Israel, you have UAE, you have UK, the US that are strongly going forward. But you have many parts of the world that are still to get any vaccinations, and less than 1% of the population is vaccinated. The second is the amount of policy support that was provided. Now, thanks to the large amount of policy support that was provided, you had only minus 3.3% growth, as opposed to what we estimated would have been closer to negative 9% growth. And so that has helped. But again, of the 16 trillion in fiscal support that was provided, the overwhelming majority was in advanced economies and not in many low-income countries and middle-income countries. So that divergence is another reason why the recoveries are growing at very different paces. So let me just give you that as a short backdrop, and I'm happy to take other questions.
Thanks. And actually, personally, I would have never imagined last year that at a time when we have the rollout of vaccines, we will have record number of fatalities and incidents and people in intensive care unit as we observe nowadays, which I think is something that at least I didn't forecast.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. And I think, in some sense, we saw the trajectory in terms of number of vaccine doses that would be available. So that should not be a surprise that there are far less part of the world that's vaccinated. By the end of the year, there's supposed to be about 9 billion doses that should be available, which is a large number. The problem, of course, is that many rich nations have pre-purchased the vast majority of that. And so that, at least in the next 6 months, there's going to be shortages around the world. And again, I think it's very important for countries to keep in mind that, it takes time to get enough vaccinations done, and countries have to be very cautious in the interim.
Yeah, which leads me to my second question, which is, I think it's close to your heart also, about India, because we saw, quote unquote, I'm allowed to say that, a policy mistake of relaxing too early with these big rallies, with these rituals, with all this outreach. And now the situation seems to be going really badly. And I want your view first on the health, and secondly, will the deterioration in India derail the growth of the world economy? Still, India is not very big, but it is interconnected to the world economy. So would you have revised your forecast of last month?
So Elias, firstly, what we're seeing in India is a really, truly ferocious second wave. And the amount of suffering it's generating is just unimaginable. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. It's really very, very troubling. And of course, we stand by the people of India. In terms of our projections for growth for India, so when we put out our forecasts about 3 weeks ago, at that time, those were numbers that were locked in March, towards the end of, I'd say March 5th, around then. So this was preceded this big, large second wave. And we had said that one of the downside risks was if there would be a very significant resurgence of the virus, that would lead to much more stringent lockdowns all over India relative to what we had assumed. We had assumed there would be some localized lockdowns because, again, the pandemic is not over. But I would say that what we're seeing now is a materialization of those downside risks. So I think we are seeing a realization of those downside risks. We're seeing very stringent restrictions that are required just to save lives. And that will have a negative impact on India's growth, especially in these months. In July, Elias, we put out our update on the forecast for countries in the world. And so we will have the number then, what will be the extent of the negative hit. It's too early to determine what that is. And of course, with India being 7% of the global economy on purchasing power parity basis, that has implications for the rest of the world. So again, in terms of actually determining the size of the impact, I think it's early days, but this is a downside risk that has materialized.
Sure, and if I was to add something here also that touches my heart and my work, Africa, there is also the danger that, what we see nowadays in India, it may soon metastasize in Africa, which I think is another risk to be factored in.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, we've, if you look at the case fatality rates and so on in many of the developing countries, they have been less severe than the developed world. But I think what the Indian case is telling you is that this pandemic is not over. The virus variant matters a lot. We're seeing a lot of mutations, and you can have, you can have really deep amount of distress. And again, to your point, which is that the world is still in very early stages of vaccination. And even for a country like India, when you have 1.4 billion population, getting to any kind of herd immunity requires a very large number of vaccines, and that takes time. And so therefore, it's very important to be vigilant in the meantime, to maintain social distancing, to wear masks, to do widespread testing, contact tracing, genome sequencing. I mean, all of this has to continue because this pandemic is not over.
Sure. Let me ask now a related question about emerging markets. So last year, I think, and also given your work, the focus was a lot on emerging markets, and many people feared at the time that we will see the Armageddon hitting emerging markets and leading to a huge financial turmoil. This was averted, I guess, because the IMF stepped in some cases, also private sector participated, but in some interventions there. But do you foresee now a danger on emerging markets, especially given, actually, let me also go to my next question, especially because the long end of the yield curve in the US, we see an uplifting there. So, perhaps higher interest rates in the US will lead capital leaving emerging markets and more directed towards the US or other rich countries.
I mean, because this crisis was truly a global crisis, as opposed to the financial crisis of 2008-09, this being a global crisis, you saw many countries stepping in with unprecedented policy support. And I believe the reason a financial crisis was averted was because you had all the major central banks of the world providing exceptional levels of liquidity. Everybody cut rates very sharply. They intervened in markets to prevent disruptive financial conditions. And that has played a very important role. And because interest rates are still low right now and expected to stay low for a while, you have a situation where many countries, though their debt levels have gone up and they've had to borrow very heavily in this crisis, the amount of debt servicing costs, their interest payments that they have to make have come down at the same time because of very low interest rates. So indeed, I think because of the global financial safety net, which includes the IMF and individual countries' reserves that they've accumulated, but also importantly, because of what the central bank actions have been, a financial crisis has been averted. Now, to your second part of your question, which is that now that we're seeing these two speeds of recoveries, what kind of risks does that pose to emerging markets? And here, the first thing to keep in mind, of course, is that when you have stronger recoveries in any part of the world, firstly, that is good for other parts of the world because of just overall global demand going up. And if you have the closer trade relations you have with those countries, the more positive the effect is going to be. And we actually did research this very carefully. We have a chapter in the April World Economic Outlook where we looked at this question of what happens when yields on U.S. treasuries go up. So when you have the phenomenon we're seeing right now, which is 10-year treasury yields rising, what is the impact on the rest of the world? And here I would say the lessons are the following. Firstly, the details matter, but what exactly is driving that increase in interest rates? So if it is coming because of better news in terms of recoveries and better employment conditions, then that has a positive effect on the rest of the world, especially the more you trade with the country. And if anything, it encourages capital flows to emerging markets. On the other hand, if the increase in interest rates come about because of a surprise tightening by the monetary authorities in the US, kind of unexpected, which leads to higher risk aversion, that has a negative effect on emerging markets. You have capital flowing out, their spreads relative to US interest rates go up sharply, financing conditions tighten. So right now, at least what we have, given what you see what's happening with yields in the situation in emerging markets, I mean, I would say that the good is outweighing the negative in terms of the fact that markets are still in a good shape, easy financial conditions for many parts of the world. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are some countries where that's not the case, where it's harder and financing costs are going up and exchange rates are depreciating more. But it's not something that we're seeing in terms of a systemic problem as of now.
Okay, so let me push a bit on that and think more about the medium run. So I'm sure that I have been following in the past months a debate between, let's say, Paul Krugman and his team and Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard, your predecessor, about how big the size of the US fiscal stimulus plan by the Trump administration, now by the Biden administration. And typically, in the end of their discussion, I followed a couple of those debates, they always say, oh, and if the fiscal plan is too large, the US Federal Reserve is always there to raise interest rates. And I was always thinking that, perhaps this would be the optimal for the US down the road, but then perhaps this would lead, to problems and financial stress in emerging markets. I understand perhaps that this is not a discussion about now, but it may soon be the discussion. So do you have any views on that?
Yeah, so there are many parts to this debate. There is the part of the debate about how much government spending should occur, how should it be tailored, how should it be targeted. There's one piece of that. The second piece is, let's take the package that was put in play, the $1.9 trillion package. What do we expect will happen in terms of inflationary pressures in the US, right? And then there's now the additional packages, which are in terms of the American jobs plan, the American family plan. There's these other aspects that are coming in. So, again, we would have to have a discussion on each piece of this. Let me just talk about the one piece in the middle, which is about what is our expectation about the impact of the $1.9 trillion plan on US inflation. And our view is that we don't see any strong argument for why there would be this persistent overshooting of inflation above the Fed's target. So yes, we expect to see some transitory increase in inflation, but nothing that would lead to a persistent increase in a way that makes it very uncomfortable relative to also the plans of the Fed at this point. And the reason for that is because of, if you look at what's happened to inflation during 2020, where we had these crazy movements in terms of unemployment numbers, you still do see that the Phillips curve still works well. When we fit the relationship, it still holds when you do it well. So given that relationship, and given that the US has seen episodes where unemployment rate has been 3.5% and unemployment rate has been 11%, and inflation has remained very close to target, and in fact, if anything, below target, again, we expect a package which is temporary in nature, not to have this kind of persistent effect. A takeaway from this is that going forward, whatever packages come up, in the design, it's very important for governments to keep in mind that if you are going to go for some kind of a very persistent increase in expenditures, which are, for instance, unfunded and rely very heavily on borrowing, that's when you really run the risk of de-anchoring inflation expectations. So you really do want to make those well-funded programs, and also those that raise potential output. And infrastructure investment does that for you. Investing in human capital does that for you. But again, you have to keep this in mind.
Sure. Actually, let me build on your argument. So, and go more to the medium run. Now, there is the question about debt. So we had the crisis of 2008, 2010, 11, which spread to Europe. Debt level increased in many parts of the world. Now we see the response of governments, especially industrial countries, that aggressively dealt with the pandemic. So we see very high levels of debt. And I see two vintages of debate. One, which very recently Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi said, it's not the time to discuss about debt now, which raises, of course, the question, when will be the relevant time? And then at Project Syndicate, I'm sure you're busy and you didn't perhaps check it, Wolfgang Schäuble, the former finance minister of Germany, said, it is time now to discuss about that. So what is the view of the fund and you about this issue? Because clearly the debt is very high. True, as you said, the sustainability any debt sustainability that I know the IMF is doing very diligently suggests that, this is good news because of low interest rates, but, how things will play out, perhaps it's uncertain.
I mean, debt levels have gone up again in this crisis, and much of it is, of course, for a good reason, which is that this was a crisis that required a lot of fiscal support, and that was absolutely essential to kind of hold the fabric of the economy together and maintain basic livelihoods and get people through to the other side so that you can have strong recoveries. So to the question of when is the right time to discuss debt, here's what our view is, which is that, of course, right now, while you're in the pandemic and it's not over, the health crisis still exists, you have to continue to provide essential support. You have to do this in a very targeted manner. Because countries are recovering at very different speed, it should be tailored to the specific of your economy, right? Now, at the same time, it helps many countries to be also thinking about sound medium-term fiscal frameworks, right? To be able to, if you have a sound medium-term fiscal framework that gives markets also the assurance that these high levels of debt ultimately will be dealt with in a sustainable way, then you're able to borrow at a cheaper cost now. And so it is going to be very much the case that countries should have credible medium-term fiscal frameworks. And once we are past this pandemic, countries will have to think about how they're going to bring down some of their debt levels, especially even if you're a country with a lot of access to financial markets. I think that what we've learned from the last decade is that these crises happen over and over again. So you want to build up buffers for the future, and that can involve both revenue raising measures, expenditure measures. Again, it depends on the detail of the country. But again, the point is now is not the time to withdraw support. Now is the time to continue to provide essential support, given that we're still in the midst of the health crisis. But again, within a sound medium-term fiscal framework, that will happen once we're past the pandemic.
Thanks, Gita. And actually, I personally think that this is a big difference vis-a-vis, I know that you cannot respond to my remark, but of the position of the fund back in 2008, 2010, and especially during the crisis in Europe, where at least in many countries, like my country of origin, Greece, drastic austerity was implemented, which to some extent, perhaps it was counterproductive. But let me go now to build on your question, on your remark, and look a bit more carefully in the US and the policies of the Biden administration, not only the 1.9 trillion stimulus, but also the subsequent bills on corporate taxes, on infrastructure, and now on promoting education and health to lower middle income households. Does the fund take a position here? Because we see clearly a dramatic shift in the tone, at least, of the US administration, which clearly has global repercussions.
Firstly, Elias, I'm happy to answer the first part of your question about changes in IMF view. I get this question a lot. I actually think the world has to admit that they've learned a lesson from the global financial crisis, and the fact that in times of crisis, when people have big hits to their livelihoods, it's very important for government spending to continue to not to prematurely withdraw support. I think everybody has learned the lesson, and you can see that in terms of the sheer numbers in terms of spending and the not just in 2020, but even in 2021. So I think that was a lesson learned. Now, of course, it helps that in this crisis, we have, it was very clear what the problem was, and that it was because it was, a pandemic, and you were telling people to go home, and you were telling offices to shut down, that you actually had to provide support. So it made it easier, but I hope that a lesson going forward will be that when there is a crisis the next time around, that these kinds of policies really, really help. Now, to your second part about the additional plans from the US administration in terms of helping with infrastructure investment, especially green investment, social safety nets, early childhood education, investing in human capital. There's several of these are in line with what the IMF has been recommending, even in the US Article 4s. So these are very important measures that are required. And again, just tying it back to my previous point, is that to do this well, you kind of have to do it comprehensively. There have to be, yes, you're going to have spending measures, but you also need to make sure you have the revenues for it. And also when it comes to climate, for instance, I would make the point that, green infrastructure investment is very important. Subsidizing R&D is important, but carbon pricing is also very important in getting there to the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, right? I mean, it's not going to happen without it. And that is not a part of the package at this point, but we hope it will be.
Sure. My follow-up question, which I think is also raised by some of our viewers, regards the policies at the OECD, and I think that the Biden administration is chipping in about a global minimum corporate tax and effectively an effort to tax, individuals and corporates at the very top. You are right. Actually, I must confess that even in the IMF programs in Greece, for example, there were always suggestions and recommendations on social welfare. But I guess perhaps it's due to bad marketing. The perception was always that it was austerity rather than social welfare that prioritized. So does the IMF intend to take a more dominant role in this discussion about setting up minimums for global corporate taxes or individual taxes?
So firstly, we are very much in favor of having a global minimum corporate tax. Countries around the world have to deal with tax avoidance and tax shifting. And if you are going to invest in both physical infrastructure and building human capital and social safety nets, you certainly need to have greater revenues for it. And so we think of this as absolutely a promising direction in which to go. I mean, of course, I will say it's quite challenging. We don't know what the number will be at which it settles. You also have to take into account, bring everybody to the table, not just the rich world, but also developing countries, to make sure that this works for different parts of the world. I think it's going to be very beneficial, but we just remember it's not going to solve every country's fiscal problems. The revenues are unlikely to be that big. So again, we believe this is a very important part of this. I mean, the OECD has been, it has been in the lead in terms of bringing this two-tier policy that they have for international taxation. We are certainly involved in it. We are particularly involved in terms of the carbon tax element. Having a minimum carbon tax is one of the proposals we have out there. So we are engaged on this front.
Sure. And actually, my next question, which I think is also raised by some of our viewers, regards poverty. And here I want to distinguish between two aspects. First, let's go to frontier economy and lower middle income countries. At least a year ago, there was the fear that all the significant gains of the world in terms of alleviating poverty and bringing down headcount poverty rates will be put in danger because of the pandemic. And the way things are unfolding in many emerging markets and frontier economies is clearly worrisome. And then a second leg regards poverty in industrial countries, in rich countries, which actually I think part of the debate now regarding the Biden plan regards this aspect. So what is your views on these two issues?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first one again?
So the first one was about poverty in frontier economies, Africa, low middle income countries.
Right. So in terms of poverty numbers, Elias, we have our estimate that in 2020, an additional 95 million people were classified as extreme poor relative to pre-pandemic projections. So that is a reversal of 2 decades of reduction in global poverty that the world was seeing. We are now really seeing this increase. And this is a major, major concern. I think this is a major issue going forward, because a part of this diverging recoveries will mean that this problem will not get fixed very quickly. We have many of these countries that are falling behind in their sustainable development goal, achieving the sustainable development. They already were falling behind in achieving the sustainable development goals, but now we are seeing an even bigger hit to their ability to get there. So, we looked at some numbers, and we have about 50% of emerging markets and developing economies that before this pandemic were converging towards high income per capita levels are now expected to diverge over these next 3 to 4 years. So that's the dangerous divergence we're worrying about. And of course, it's not just cross country, but it's also within country. Even within country, we're seeing big differences in the the people who are getting affected by this crisis. Younger workers, lower educated workers, women in many sectors are just getting much harder hit. And that's a divergence that countries will have to deal with. And the reason I worry about it more is also because, even if the health crisis is over, what this pandemic has triggered is greater automation. And with greater automation, we know comes a period of greater inequality and diverging prospects within countries. And unfortunately, we haven't had the best of policies to deal with it in the past, but that has to change going forward.
Yeah, and actually, I'm keep getting a question that I wanted to ask in the end, but it has various aspects, so let me pose it now. So, the title of our series is Rethinking Globalization. So, are we in a phase of that the paradigm that the world economy and the world societies have lived in the past 3 to 4 decades being challenged? We see more state, the IMF, the World Bank, many governments pushing for an expansion of government, focusing on the poor, poverty alleviation programs, education, green. Do we see a paradigm shift? What is your view here?
Yes, I would say that there are, important shifts in the relationship between the state and the people and the interactions between them. We've had problems that precede this crisis, which is rising inequality, which has been a big issue within countries. And that obviously has triggered the need to change policies to address this rising inequality. And I think this crisis has just made that so much more clear, that the importance of universal healthcare, the importance of universal access to, broadband, all of this, basic livelihoods. I mean, all of that it's come out very starkly in this crisis. So this is, a very important issue that countries are having to address. Now, at the same time, I worry that, there has also been this big increase in nationalism. And when you look at especially vaccines and vaccine distribution, it's certainly, you see vaccine nationalism everywhere. And if you don't have production happening in your own country, the risks of export controls, the risk that you will not get the inputs when you need them are real. I mean, you're seeing it right now, right? And so, I can see how countries will, at least in the future, start thinking about making sure that a bunch of some of this production of essentials takes place in their own home territory. And that's, I think, where the world needs to do better in terms of, at least globally, coming together to solve some of these problems. I mean, this is, the problem of vaccines is not a surprise. It was known in the second half of last year that there would be these vaccines. What was needed was a global action to make sure that there would be sufficient production worldwide and availability to the most vulnerable population in every part of the world. Now, COVAX was part of that, was an important part of that initiative, but it hasn't gone so well.
Yeah, and actually, I agree with you, because there are like those two forces we see. On the one hand, governments, looking much more inward, looking at the inequities that were building up for decades, but at least for the past 4 decades, after the early 80s and perhaps the mid 90s for emerging markets, was in this globalization. So as you rightly point out, perhaps this system is now put in jeopardy. So as we are running out of time, and let me thank everybody for your questions. We don't have much time to go over all of them, but what would you say are going to be the challenges for the world economy in the medium run? So once the pandemic is over, should that be the priority, or dealing with the inequities that, as you rightly pointed out, were there before and got magnified by the pandemic?
So once we're past this pandemic and we're looking out, for me, what I see, of course, is the increase in inequality that the world has to grapple with. Now, there's going to be this increase in inequality, that's international increase in inequality, which the COVID crisis has created. But within countries too, you will see many more people bouncing back, but at the same time, you will have segments of the population that will be permanently hit by this crisis. And again, depending upon what the country is and the amount of support, fiscal support that could be given, you could see it very differently. So for instance, there are many small and medium enterprises that right now are benefiting from government support. And when, for instance, the moratoria on loan payments are withdrawn, our projection is that there will be very likely be an significant increase in bankruptcies, and that could put 1 in 10 jobs at risk. So I think those problems are still going to have to be dealt with. So inequality is a big one, and tying into that is automation and what's the nature of jobs going to be. These are, again, problems that precede this crisis, but I think it's become even more urgent. The second one, of course, is climate crisis. I mean, we've seen a pandemic crisis. Climate crisis is near and present. We are seeing, it was a concern before the pandemic. Thankfully, I'm seeing a lot of initiative on that front, people pushing to address the risks from climate change, to mitigate climate change. And so hopefully 2021 will be a year where countries actually walk the talk in terms of the amount of investments that they're doing in green technology and green infrastructure, but also in terms of carbon pricing, and also to make this a just transition, just as in JUS, just transition, which is to make sure that those who will lose livelihoods because they currently work in fossil fuel sectors, that they're able to transition to newer kinds of jobs, and those who will be affected by rising carbon prices and rising energy costs, that they will also be compensated. And there are ways to do it, and we have very interesting research. A third big issue is on debt. Most countries, almost all countries, will exit this crisis with high levels of debt. Now, there are some, if you're a reserve currency issuer like the US and you have, or Europe, many countries there, you are able to borrow at low rates, and you're able to have the luxury of time to bring down debt levels slowly as share of GDP. But there are many others that don't have that luxury of time. And for them, many of them will require continued debt relief, and this is what we're seeing right now. But in some cases, debt restructuring, the G20 Common Framework is about that. You need to be able to restructure the debt so that they don't have the big debt overhang going forward. And again, so I think these are the legacies of this crisis that will continue. So even once the health crisis is over, there will be a period of uncertainty about what happens to the world as policy support is withdrawn, as you have diverging recoveries, as the US grows faster, as interest rates rise. So again, there's a lot more that's going to happen in the transition, even before we get to the 4 or 5 year period out.
Sure. So let me, since we're running out of time also, let me just say, though, that it seems that governments will have a lot of things to work at, even after the pandemic is over. And the issues, the driving forces of populism, of nationalism, like automation, as you mentioned, or the crisis by itself, are most likely going to be still around. So it's going to be very tricky for policymakers, to implement the right policies, given the backlash that perhaps we will see also in the years to come. So, please.
Sorry, go on.
No, please.
No, I was going to say that, the policymakers will have a lot of issues, problems to deal with, but I think we should also give some credit for some of the successes that have happened, which is that, despite having a record recession in 2020, there was no financial crisis. And I think that is huge. And, I think going forward, you will have to continue to expect, especially major central banks, to very clearly communicate their intentions, do it in a very decisive manner to make sure that, financial conditions stay where they are. Second, on the vaccine front, remarkable success on vaccine discovery. But again, a lot more needs to be done on getting vaccine access to many parts of the world. And I would say a warning to the world that vaccinations will take time. So please don't let down your guard, and make sure you do the good practices in terms of social distancing, testing, tracing, genome sequencing, and so on. Because many parts of the world provided large amounts of policy support to their people. Even though many of them had lower incomes, their consumption levels were maintained, and this was true particularly in the rich world. So I think that's helped prevent social unrest. But in developing parts of the world, I do worry that where you don't have the space to provide this kind of support, that you could end up with social unrest that could then spill over into geopolitical tensions. And so again, I think the big takeaway is that this crisis is global. It needs global solutions, and countries really have to work even more closely together to make sure that the world as a whole comes out of this, not in a place with great divergences and with all kinds of geopolitical tensions.
Sure, and actually, let me jump on a question I'm seeing from the floor. Specifically, what can the rich countries and the IMF perhaps can do, mostly for the most vulnerable in low-income countries? So, is debt forgiveness one way forward, or reprofiling the debt, I guess, with very long maturity?
Right. So, I mean, I can tell you, firstly of all, in terms of what the IMF has done, because of the unique nature of this crisis, which required getting money very quickly into the hands of low-income countries, we've done mostly emergency financing. We've provided emergency financing to 80 plus countries, the majority of them being low-income countries, which is financing without conditionalities, just to make sure that they're able to use the money quickly to help their, the finance, the health sector, to provide cash to the poor households. And so that has been a big part of the initiative. The second has been debt relief. So, I mean, the IMF has been providing debt relief to its poorest members who owe loans to the IMF. The G20 has also provided debt relief, but more in the form of postponing repayment. But that has helped in the near term. It goes on until the middle of this year, June 2021. And our hope is that they will extend it till the end of the year. Just most recently, there has, we have now momentum, and the membership has, given us the green signal to go ahead and put together a proposal for SDR allocations, for those who know what that is, which is, again, an unconditional increase in reserves for poorer nations and for other countries in the world too, which will help them deal with this. But in terms of what else needs to be done, I think the big challenges are countries that have very high levels of debt that are already unsustainable, and you have to restructure that. The G20 common framework is one way to make that happen. But again, I think a lot depends in the implementation, and this is where many institutions, including the IMF, are working on.
Gita, thank you. I mean, it's a great seeing you again after this pandemic, have kept and restricted travel. It's great that we covered all those issues in just 45 minutes. Clearly, this is not how things are done in the academic seminars that we attend. So thanks big time. We understand how busy you are, and we're truly grateful for you taking the time and being with us. We truly appreciate that.
Oh, thanks, Elias. This is a pleasure as always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks all for your great questions. Let me just mention that at London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development website, you will be able to see, and this video will be available shortly. You can also see our earlier Rethinking Globalization series. For example, in January, we hosted Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And let me also flag two upcoming events, one Better Marketing for Better World initiative, and a special issue for the Journal of Marketing. And we have also actually a very interesting a series of events, Voice of the Village Roundtable series in collaborations with Dharma Life City and the Wheeler Institute, where we hear women from underprivileged Indian communities and interact with them. Thank you all very much for being with us today, and keep safe and healthy.